One of the things we have to remember is that all these different social media formats, you're getting lost, you're getting suppressed, but they mostly reward, to an extent, there is too much posting, multiple posts for thing. Most people post that the podcast is out a single time. So then my thing is how do you keep changing context so that it's rewarding for the person who's following you, who maybe consumed it, but it's also more spreadable.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast life. Today I am joined by Jesse Cannon, and we are going to talk all about what goes into producing charting podcasts in particular, but overall just producing podcasts in general as well. Jesse, how are you doing?
I am great and super excited to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. If people don't know, Jesse and I work together on probably more podcasts than either of us could name at this point. But Jesse, why don't you start with explaining what some of the shows you work on are and what your role is with them?
Yes. So I have a company called Musformation Growth, where what I basically do is I provide infrastructure to people who want to do a podcast. So everybody has different needs. Some people need just edits. Some people need me to write a whole show for them. Some people need me to write a whole documentary for them, and then they want to just read it. I fill in the blanks. So some of the shows I do are The Daily Beast, The New Abnormal, and The Last Laugh. I do Fast Politics with Molly Jong-Fast, which is also big. For the Griot, I do the series Being Black, which we've won. We swept the podcast awards this year. And I do a ton of others for media companies like Airmail and Rolling Stone, including their hit podcast 500 Greatest Songs.
So we're going to go ahead and start at the very beginning of producing a show. What's the typical lead time from you getting a job as a producer on a show and actually getting that show launched? I know you typically will do 2 or 3 pilot episodes at least before you guys sort of fine-tune things and do a launch.
I like to call them test episodes personally, but yes, that's correct. What typically happens is somebody says to me, we want to launch this in 2 weeks, and then they run around doing things that make that not happen. But it's usually like about a month because, we're going to want to do these test episodes because they make the first episode way better, and you're usually going to get a big jump of attention, and you want to be, you want to fix some of the flaws. Obviously, I have yet to work on a podcast where we've gotten to episode 100 and don't look back on the early episodes in absolute shame. But that is really the thing is like, we were doing one earlier today, and we're on the 3rd test episode, and like the first one I had 10 notes, the next one I had 4, and now I have 1, and that's a pretty common trajectory. But you also need to do competition reports, you need to consider positioning, you need to consider artwork, drop day, music, all sorts of things in how you differentiate yourself in the market, and that's a lot of the development of it.
Yeah, because a lot of the shows that you're working on are in 2 very crowded spaces, in particular, politics and music. And yes. With the pilot episodes, or test episodes as you call them, do you find that they serve a different purpose depending on what category the show is in or what type of show it is? Because I know with Fast Politics and The New Abnormal, we're doing 2 to 3 interviews per show, whereas with something like 500 Greatest Songs, it's a main segment and just 1 interview. Do you find you have to sort of tweak the format of the episodes through those first few tests?
The format is what I think often gets tweaked the least, except for if we do a reoccurring segment. So a good example is one that you and I have been working on that has not released yet, so we can't really say it by name. It's very rare somebody has 6 good ideas of reoccurring segments. They had 6 that all were better than most podcasts. Very creative people. Another one I just went about, they had 3 very solid ideas. I'm like, okay, great. We're going to have to try these out, see which one works best, but maybe we even have to see what the audience responds to. Because one of the things people don't realize is those reoccurring segments, some people hate them, but other people, that is their favorite part of the podcast, is they like coming back for it. I know personally, like one of the things I like about a podcast is I like seeing a variable in somebody's behavior, and that variable is often a guess, but also just seeing the way they're changing and being able to clock that is interesting.
Yeah, and with the launch of a podcast obviously comes having to promote it. What have you done in the past that has been the most effective as far as promoting a podcast on launch?
The main thing on launch is who can you get to co-sign you, say they're excited about this, getting future guests to say, I'm on one of these, you should really get subscribed. Things like that is a very good method. But for people who don't have that, I am convinced there should not be shame around being in Reddits and Discords and having a second account that also does comment baiting. One of the things I successfully launch things with all the time is that I have a sock puppet account that I comment bait with when I launch things. I do it all the time. I go in and I say, here's a good example. Has anyone gone through low testosterone in their middle age as a man, and had it affect their musical output? Well, let's say I wrote an essay on that. Then the other account is going to comment, well, actually, there's a really good thing on it right here. And because then it's in Reddit for Google and all these things, and it does a nice slow job of slowly building up traffic. So that's one thing I believe in that people have stigmatized, but really does work, and a lot of people do it, and no one likes to talk about it. But I have no time for no one likes to talk about.
Have you found that it's still difficult to get people from other platforms like Instagram or TikTok to listening and subscribing to a podcast?
So now we're in one of my favorite subjects. So the problem when people analyze data a lot is when they don't like the data, they either say this is dead or this isn't doing or it isn't doing the thing. And the real thing with this data is that in some formats, it's so easy. You know, like if you are a Gen Zer where your podcast format is one person saying something and the other person says facts back while they have the millennial perm, that type of podcast converts really well, promoting on TikTok and getting people to jump over. Entrepreneurial podcasts convert very well. Political podcasts do not. Interview-based podcasts, it's a little bit better than the ones I just said don't work very well. But in general, that is a big thing, is that, you know, the data is messy by genre and by listener type. But one of the things I have become very convinced of, silos are real. You don't see people who watch both TikToks, Reels, and Shorts on YouTube. You don't see people who like reading interviews in magazines and newsletters also listen to podcasts. They're very distinct behavior differences, and that can be used to your advantage. A lot of what I'm doing right now is I'm getting people that I'm working with to convert over to turning their podcasts into newsletters and saying, listen, if you'd rather listen to this, it's on YouTube, and you can listen to it in the lock screen on your commute today if you would prefer to hear it that way. This is just a transcription where I've noted some things.
Sort of in a similar vein, you work with musicians and have a lot of tips with Spotify in particular, because that's obviously one of the biggest streaming services for music. It's become bigger and bigger with podcasts lately, and I believe you can even now like create a playlist with podcast episodes. And I know you and I have talked about that. We maybe haven't played around with it as much as we would have liked, but what do you find it takes to get a podcast on the charts for Apple and Spotify? I know with Apple in particular too, the rules for like how you get on the new and noteworthy page in Apple have changed over the years. But what do you think makes a show worthy of being in the top charts?
Yeah. So what's interesting is so for Apple, a big distinction is the show chart versus the episode chart. So the show chart is actually who is subscribing to it. So you have the most chance of doing that when you first launch. I've had 2 podcasts go to the top 5, 3 go to the top 20, and all of those are early days because that's the easiest time to do it. We got one of them to number 1. The point being, then there's top episodes. So top episodes is actually consumption. You can have, you know, the daily, for example, often will have most of the week in the top 10 all the time in it. You know, some of the other more psychotic right-wing podcasts will also have a few episodes in the top 20. One of the other crazy things that you learn when you get in these spaces is a lot of people go, oh, well, the problem with current event podcasts is no one listens after day 1. And you're like, oh, buddy, week 2, they're going strong still. And a month or 2 months later, on a show that gets 50,000 listens per episode, you could pick up an extra 1,000 in the 30 days after it's already out of date. So what I would even say is week 6, you still could be getting a couple hundred listens a day if you really killed it with that launch. So the point being, though, with how do you get into charts, to answer your question and not dodge, is one, I think a good call to action. One of the things everybody does is like, leave us a review on. It's like, sure, I get the thing with reviews, but I can literally watch how much it changes when you switch the call to action over to keep the conversation going and send this to a friend so you can discuss it with them, is a huge thing for a lot of podcasts, especially if you really are creating a discussion around something. Our podcast Being Black is a big discussion. One of the most interesting things with the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Songs list and 500 Greatest Albums list is a lot of people go through them one by one and want to learn about them and get musically educated through them. So if you can incite that, that's one thing. Another thing, too, is I think a lot of people don't have a day 2 promotion plan, never mind a day 7 promotion plan for their podcast. One of the things we have to remember is that all these different social media formats, you're getting lost, you're getting suppressed, but they mostly reward, to an extent, there is too much posting, multiple posts for a thing. And most people post that the podcast is out a single time. So then my thing is how do you keep changing context so that it's rewarding for the person who's following you, who maybe consumed it, but it's also more spreadable. So a good example with this is if you Google Jesse Cannon music marketing trends, I have a newsletter. And one of the things with the interviews I do is I do a lightning round with the guest, and that only goes in the newsletter. So then so the best answer of that can go in social media on day 3 or 4, let's say. So you're giving this really great answer everybody does, and then they're like, oh, well, I want to dig into that interview. This person said this thing, even though that question may not be in the interview, but it still is giving value, and it can be giving virality. If that inspires shares, great, then the post gets seen by more. Maybe it goes into discovery and more people discover your podcast. The other thing I think everybody forgets, people don't study what is going on with social now. So like, for example, there's been 2 monumental changes in how to get your posts to go further recently. Is one, if you are on the cursed short form text network X, putting your link in a reply in the second tweet compared to the first is a monumental difference in how much reach it gets, because Elon nukes you if the link is in your first reply. But if you put a picture of the podcast, so for example, on this week's Music Marketing Trends, I'm talking with blank, and you put that person's picture with Music Marketing Trends and episode 13, streaming now on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Nice little graphic. Right below it, listen here wherever you get your podcasts, and you link to Podlink or episodes.fm, whatever one you do. You're going to get way more reach on your post. Another thing that does amazing algorithmic juice, one, people don't get that doing a carousel on Instagram will give your reach infinitely more reach than if you just do a single picture. Then, if you pile it on top of it and you have a guest on your podcast, you do a collaborative post. Collaborative posts get usually 5x reach. I don't really want to launch anything unless we're doing a collaborative post and a carousel. I actively design everything I promote to have both.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I, at the time when I had my other podcasts, was definitely guilty of the post it once because I don't want to be annoying. And it almost never worked. You'd get like 3 likes on the original tweet or whatever it was, and then it's just gone, 24 hours later, essentially. And so towards the end of both Chat Cemetery and Welcome to Geekdom, I sort of started playing around with it a little more, but admittedly, I was that person who was always terrible at promoting my podcast, because by the time I was done doing everything else for it, I was just wiped. I was like, it's hard because if you really want a show to do well, from my understanding is you have to spend almost just as much time marketing it as you do producing it. But on the producing note, how do you avoid overproducing a show and, never getting episodes out on time because you're always like trying to make it perfect.
Determining your time of development is really important. So what I mean by that is if you're doing evergreen material, you should probably be a couple podcast episodes ahead. A good example is my YouTube channel where I discuss music marketing. My goal is to be 8 episodes ahead by the end of the year. So that way, if somebody gets COVID, they got maternity leave, whatever it is on the team, there's no one falling behind, even if we're 2 weeks late on things because we're 8 weeks ahead. And sure, every once in a while, something will happen that's seismic and we'll shift the video to go into production this week and we'll move one back another week. That's going to happen from time to time, but that's one of the keys. 2 is understanding production schedule. Like we are well over 1,000 episodes deep into some of the current events podcasts, and we're never, ever late aside from when the podcast providers are late putting them up, and that is it. And what I mean by that is you can often schedule a podcast to go up at 12:01. Usually they'll be up by 12:10, and then some of them, though, will take till 12:25 and take their sweet time to put themselves up, even though you've done everything right.
In the grand scheme of things, that's not late in comparison to most things. But I have definitely found that doing things like having a very detailed spreadsheet helps when it comes to, doing things like keeping track of episodes when you want to release them, especially if you're doing something where you're going to have guests on. So like this podcast, I have a list of people I have reached out to. I have a list of people I want to reach out to. I have then, a list of who has already been scheduled, what has already gone up. And when I was doing my Stephen King podcast, I literally had every single book, movie, TV show in a spreadsheet arranged by their original release dates. So I was going in chronological order, and a friend kindly helped me with a bunch of filters on it. So it made it a little easier to see what was what. But I don't think I would have gotten through that podcast if I did not have that spreadsheet, because it allowed me to just plug in the guest, plug in the date we were set to record, what the post date was, and I then could read and watch things according to what those end dates were, and I knew how far ahead I had to be. So yeah, I definitely recommend having a spreadsheet, Airtable, something. It doesn't really matter what it is.
I think Airtable is the game changer one as far as making content schedules, yeah. Along with make.com for automations, it really is amazing what you can do with it.
Yeah, it is. So you mentioned competition reports.
Yeah.
I am vaguely familiar with those, mostly through my conversations with you.
Yeah.
But for anyone who is unfamiliar, what are those? What purpose do they serve?
Okay, so here's a good example. Is a couple of years ago, I launched a podcast that was going to be kind of like internet culture. Like we're going to discuss what's the big stuff on the internet. So to understand that, there's other podcasts in that field. So we got to understand what they're doing and set ourselves apart. Another example is I used to have a podcast called Fever Dreams that discussed like QAnon and conspiracy theories. There's other podcasts who do that. So when you launch, a lot of things are important to consider, because think of it this way. Let's say you launch and there's another one people already listen to, and it has like bleepy bloopy electronic music. And then you do bleepy bloopy electronic music. What people are going to do is they're going to go, whether you're better or not at this, and I thought my hosts were the best in the game, they would go, oh, they're ripping off blank who did this before, even if you're the better one. But here's the thing. If you then think about what's authentic to the hosts in their attitude. So, for example, my hosts were really chaotic. We were pretty we always the tone of the show we always said should feel like somebody could just blow up and walk off. It was just wild and crazy. We were going to say something that could get us fired from the news organization. We worked out we're discussing, at one point had to discuss a father maiming their children. It was all sorts of crazy things to discuss. So the point being, what symbolized that? We're like, okay, we want chaotic style, rock, where it just sounds like you're literally what the fuck is this sound? We even put a helicopter whirring as an instrument over this grunge song, basically, to make it just be what is happening every time you even hear anything. And so, but that aligned with the vibe and separated us from all our other competition. So back to the competition report, I go through and I find every podcast that actually has real consumption. What I mean by real consumption is there is sometimes, for example, I made one of these this week, and one of the podcasts that we had actually discussed in the meeting, because we knew because it's a famous person doing it, we were like, oh, well, we got to make sure we don't do anything like that. And then their numbers were public, and their numbers were under 1,000 listens per episode. Their biggest episode's 2,000. I'm like, we don't really need to actually worry about this too much because we're not that similar to it. And no one cares about this podcast. But the point being, you do want to be aware of that, because here's another good example. So with that gossip one, we figured out no one dropped on a certain day. And what I mean by that is what day does your episode go up? So if you're a once-a-week podcast, that's very crucial. And a good example is almost every format now, Friday is cooked. If you put out onto any other day, you're going to do way better. And a real hack for current events is putting it up on Monday. We see way better numbers because one of my podcasts is the only one that comes out on Mondays, because we're the only people psychotic enough to work through the weekend. Another thing you want to consider is your reoccurring segment too much like somebody? Is your artwork too much like somebody? How do you differentiate yourself from that? Length of show. One of the weirdest things is some people are like, man, all these podcasts do 28 minutes, but I wish I could hear a whole hour. Well, if you're able to carry it for an hour with good personalities and your hosts are that good, well, now you just secured yourself all these people who want more. And contrary to popular belief, most of the studies on podcasting is people wish their favorite podcasts were longer. Even Joe Rogan at 3.5 hours, which, God help me, no.
Yeah, I remember when I was starting Chat Cemetery and I was looking at the other Stephen King podcasts that were out there, and I came across The Losers Club, which is one of the biggest Stephen King podcasts that's still going. And I saw that they had a 4-hour episode on it. And I looked at it and I went, well, I won't be doing that, so I think I'll be okay. Honestly, mine, I started for a selfish reason. I was like, I've been looking at these Stephen King books that my mom owns for so many years, just like sitting on a bookshelf outside my room. I was like, I want to read them all. The only way I can do that is if I make it a podcast and have deadlines.
Yeah, I do this all the time. It's like, I have a member feed on my YouTube channel. And what it basically really was it was a way for me to monetize my studying. Is that there were some weeks I would miss my studies of like seeing what's going on with music marketing. But once I had to do the member feed, it's like, okay, every week I now have to show my members what I've been studying. Yeah. So there's no more ditching your studies. And it's been great discipline. I've been doing it for about 7, 8, 9 months now. And it's fantastic discipline. I never miss a week. And also, I get paid for my studying.
That certainly does help.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to move to some rapid fire questions. So
Great.
The first one, what is your favorite podcast format? Interview, solo, co-host, what is it?
So I love documentary style podcasts, but no one makes them on subjects I care about. I listen to one new podcast every single week, so I do try out a lot of formats, but I find I respond well to what I call the shoot the shit then variables format, which is basically, so my favorite podcast, the one podcast I listen to no matter what every episode, is How Long Gone. Their format is very simple. It is they shoot the shit for a little while, then they bring in somebody to shoot the shit for a while. Around 1 hour and 20 minutes each episode. They don't even have a reoccurring segment, which most things do. They definitely have reoccurring subjects, but I love that. The funny thing is How Long Gone also will do just episodes where they have no guest and they two just talk to each other. They claim those do sometimes do better than the guest episodes. The point being, my favorite format is definitely something like shoot the shit and then let's throw some variables in, whether those are interviews or a reoccurring segment. I like the constant thing of two people going back and forth. One of the reasons I've always been hesitant about ever doing a new music business podcast, I used to have one with our mutual friend who we know each other from, Zach Cirillo. And him and I did that format where we would go back and forth on some subjects and then interview someone. But I've never found anybody I could like interlock with, and that's why I've never done another one.
Yeah. So what's your biggest podcasting pet peeve?
I mean, bad and lack there of editing. I thought about this last night. It was like I heard 3 minutes on a podcast of someone trying to figure out their answer. Like, oh, let me think. There's this book. Oh, I'll walk over to my book. I can't find the book. Oh, it was right over here. Why did I hear all that? Just get to the part where they go, oh my God, it's Orwell's Revenge. It was written by the Supreme Court clerk, and it's this thing where you like kind of updated 1984 about how it would really go down. It's such a great book. Literally, the answer was shorter than the looking for it.
Yeah, I remember I listened to a bunch of movie podcasts because I was just doing like a deep dive on those particular types of podcasts. And there was one, someone had done an episode of Carrie. I don't even remember the name of the podcast anymore, which is probably good because I won't mention it anyway. But it took them an hour to start talking about the movie. And the episode was like 3 or 4 hours long. And I was just like, I don't even think I made it to the conversation about the movie before turning it off. But last rapid fire question, you mentioned How Long Gone. What is the other best podcast that you've listened to lately?
I love Switched on Pop. That one always blows me away. It's very funny because, like every podcast I really like has usually been at it for quite a while. Mm-hmm. How Long Gone's 4 years. Switched on Pop, I think I wrote them a letter in 2016 when I got into them, which is a funny thing too because like over the years I've connected with a lot of my favorite hosts. I love Creator Science. You and I send each other things from Jay Klaus all the time. I think what he does is pretty exceptional. Oh, it was really fun? There's this new podcast called Rehash. Might not even be that new, but rehashes discussions of the internet and like edgy little pieces of the internet and culture, and they give you like a TLDR on them. I really, really love that. I also really love Team Human from Douglas Rushkoff. He's one of the smartest people alive, and I always learn a lot from it.
Okay. Yeah, I will have to check those out. Well, Jesse, that wraps up everything that I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
I always enjoy talking to you, and I really appreciate you having me.